Hey everyone, my name is Jake Dooling, and today I will be talking to you about climate change and its effect on the prevalence and persistence of human pathogens. I wanted to start out by talking about some of the predicted changes that are set to accompany climate change. The first I'd like to focus on is increase in global temperatures. Um, of course, this includes the capture of UV radiation in the environment, which causes global warming due to increases in greenhouse gas emissions from human beings. And as you can see from the stat here, that between 1.8 and 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit increase from 1990 has been seen. And next up, I wanted to talk about changes in rainfall patterns. This can be manifested depending on the area by increases and decreases in rainfall, and also increases in heavy precipitation events. And of course, in those events, seeing a decrease in rainfall could lead to drought events, like which I will talk about later. Next, I'd like to talk about the strength and frequency of natural disasters, and research has shown that climate change can have a sizable effect on the strength and frequency of natural disasters, so we can expect more storms that rely on low pressure systems such as hurricanes and typhoons. And next, I would like to focus on drought and heat events. And then finally, I will talk about sea level rise. And as a result of the predicted increases in global temperature, a lot of the water kept in the ice caps would be deposited into the ocean. And this would be the reason why sea levels are expected to rise. And sea levels are expected to rise from 1 to 4 feet by 2100, or the year 2100, which would put a lot of coastal cities in danger of flooding. And throughout this presentation, I will detail how human pathogens can persist and possibly affect humans to a greater extent as a result of these environmental changes. So, first, I will talk about increases in global temperature. And increases in temperature could shift or expand the habitable environment in which human pathogens could exist. This could be applicable to both the latitude and the altitude of the suitable environment. So not only could it be east or west, it could be, or north and south, it could be higher up people are or lower area regions. And then some pathogens may be able to exist and thrive in new and previous environments, while others may not be able to survive at all. So, for example, viruses, bacteria, and parasites native to more temperate regions in the world may not be able to adapt to warmer conditions. And rivaling that, some of the warmer conditioned pathogens may be able to expand their presence beyond where they normally are now. And their environmental reservoirs could also be negatively affected, leading to a decrease in their prevalence. And this is, of course, talking about the temperate pathogens. And this shift could possibly introduce new pathogens into the population, as I mentioned earlier, and increase the possibility of outbreak events in susceptible populations. And of course, higher temperatures and can increase the disease transmission period from, for example, malaria can have affected dynamics of transmission with heightened levels of transmission and infection. This just opens up the period. If it's warmer longer, the vectors that transfer malaria, such as the mosquitoes, may have a longer time frame to reproduce and deliver that pathogen to humans. Next, I would like to talk about temperatures and continue talking about the increase in global temperatures. Temperature increases could also affect the vector populations. Temperature increases could affect these vector populations, such as mosquitoes and ticks. This measure could either see increases or decreases in vector populations depending on the environment. And temperature especially affects the arthropod vectors, such as ticks and mosquitoes, because they are cold-blooded and rely on, they don't have the thermoregulation like humans and many mammals do. And of course, this could lead to the spread of Lyme disease and tick populations, because Lyme disease is a relatively concerning disease that is spread by ticks and is caused by the bacteria Borrelia burgdorferi. And according to an article published in Bioscience by Leslie Ogden, details black-legged ticks carrying this pathogen as far as Canada, which tends to be a pretty temperate area. And the article claims that they can complete their life cycle and persist in order due to warmer temperatures in this area. And increases in global temperatures could see an increase in the tick persistence in the environment, potentially leading to more cases of Lyme disease, which would not be a good thing for populations, especially in more temperate areas. And of course, we could also see the spread of diseases like West Nile virus in southeastern Europe in 2010, which saw an increase following increased summer temperatures. And of course, West Nile virus is a vector-borne disease that is spread by mosquitoes and is similar to the ticks. Mosquitoes rely on warm, habitable temperatures in order to breed and survive. And as I stated earlier, there was an increase in Southeast Europe following temperatures that were higher than normal. And this West Nile virus was only known to be present in southern France, but following these high temperatures, the disease spread to other areas throughout Europe, or southern Europe. The mosquitoes were likely traveled farther and infected more due to the lessened temperature constraints that they had to deal with. So next, I'm going to transition into changes in rainfall patterns. And of course, we can see increases in heavy rainfall events, as I mentioned earlier, which could promote the development of standing water. And standing water is a crucial part of the mosquito's life cycle and breeding. And increased pools of standing water could lead to increased incidence of mosquito-related diseases like malaria, dengue, and West Nile virus, like we mentioned previously. It can be especially dangerous if the standing water is accumulated near places of residence, like where large cities, and these populations living near these standing water would have an increased chance of being bitten by these mosquitoes and being, of course, infected with one of these dangerous diseases. Also, heavy rainfall has been associated with infectious enteric diseases. These diseases are often supported by flooding conditions like the vector-borne diseases produced by heavy rainfall. And the flood conditions can contaminate water sources with sewage. And this sewage can contain fecal matter that is ingested when the water is consumed. The fecal matter can contain pathogens such as Vibrio cholerae, Shigella neurovirus, and E. coli. Among many other dangerous enteric diseases. Once introduced into a populated environment, these diseases can spread extremely quick if not mitigated properly, because they often utilize the fecal oral route, and of course, in disaster-related events and flooding, that may lead to evacuation, which we'll discuss a little later. And this can become a serious issue, especially in developing countries, because these countries may not possess well-manufactured sewer systems, and also sanitation and hygiene practices may be underdeveloped and conducive to the quick spread of enteric diseases. And of course, some of these countries may not even have sewage systems to begin with, so this could create really easy exposure and possible spread of these enteric diseases. So next, I'd like to talk about the intensity and frequency of natural disasters. And again, with events like hurricanes and typhoons and tsunamis, there's an increase in flooding events as a result. And of course, again, this great expanding water can lead to increases in vector-borne diseases like mosquitoes, West Nile, dengue, like many of those mentioned earlier. This idea was described earlier with the increase in the precipitation events, but natural disasters such as hurricanes, typhoons, and flash floods could leave greater amounts of standing water than normal heavy rainfall events would. And also, this standing water may be less transient and remain in the environment longer, meaning it could just sit there and it may take longer to evaporate or just disappear from the environment. And due to the sheer quality deposited, the extreme flooding could penetrate deeply both urban and rural environments. So it doesn't necessarily depend on where you live. This could affect either or. And this could see a rise in mosquito populations in densely populated areas, especially in the urban setting. And if a lot of these standing water deposited areas are in areas highly populated, we can see quick spread of diseases like malaria. And we could also see a possible increases in certain waterborne diseases, like as previously discussed, the enteric diseases, cholera, shigellosis, and giardia could be put in closer contact with human populations. And also, extreme flooding can also shift other non-arthropod species closer to human populations, and especially rodents. And we'll see with as their cause in leptospirosis. And leptospirosis can be of great concern following disaster-related flood events because these flooding conditions can push many rodent species out of their natural habitat and into areas occupied by humans. And these rodents deposit the bacterial pathogen Leptospira into the water through their urine. So this particular bacterium is concerning because it can affect humans through contact with mucosal membranes. So essentially, the CDC states that this disease can be contracted through swimming, wading through water, and completing other recreational activities in contaminated water. This can be anything from boating to paddleboarding, fishing, anything that puts you in contact with water, which makes this disease especially concerning in flood conditions because all it needs to do is make contact and can easily affect you. And of course, these flooding conditions can make avoiding contact with contaminated water very difficult. Continuing on with the natural disasters, the destruction of infrastructure as a result of a disaster event can lead to mass migration of people and the need for crowded shelters, crowded temporary shelters at least. And events like tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes have been known to severely damage infrastructure and residences, and putting people in these situations in need of some sort of temporary shelter often ended up in those shelters. These temporary shelters can end up fostering crowding conditions. And as you can see, close conditions can mediate the spread of communicable diseases. And many people together in a confined area give pathogens the opportunity to spread quickly. And it is important that to remember that hygiene and sanitation are must be kept up to an acceptable standard in order not to introduce pathogens into a crowded shelter environment. And according to the CDC, those suspected of infection should be quarantined within the shelter or be sent to another shelter if they are screened and found to have one of these communicable diseases before entering the shelter at all. Some of the diseases that can thrive in these conditions include pneumonia, which is spread via the contact or respiratory excretions, and meningitis, which is spread as an aerosol. And pneumonia and meningitis can be spread quickly in crowded shelter conditions due to their capability of aerosol travel, of course. So things like sneezes and coughs can easily and often inconspicuously spread these diseases, so many people might not even know they've been infected until it's too late. Also, another disease would be cholera, again due to the food or water contamination as a result of poor sanitation and hygiene, and measles, which can spread especially quickly in vaccinated countries. And vaccination levels are of utmost importance in these crowded areas because if these crowded areas allow for, especially in unvaccinated populations, for diseases to spread quickly. And this is the need. Herd immunity needs to be high in order to prevent against outbreaks. And in the case of the measles, the World Health Organization recommends a 90% vaccination rate in order to prevent a measles outbreak in a shelter condition. And next, I'd like to talk about drought and heat events. So, of course, drought is a water shortage caused by lack of rainfall, and water shortages during droughts can force farmers to use recycled water on their crops. And harmful material in this recycled water could contaminate food products, which is definitely a dangerous end product. This could lead to harmful foodborne pathogens such as E. coli and Salmonella and allow them to enter into the food system. So foodborne infections would be unique in that they could spread quickly outside of the affected area. So contaminated foods can be shipped across a country or even across the world due to the shipping of food and trade and how quickly food is spread around the nation and the world. So, for example, an individual from Florida can be infected with E. coli from crops that were grown in California. We see this almost every year with breakouts of Salmonella and other dangerous foodborne diseases, but they're often not in the spot of where they originate from, which is another issue, because if we do not know where they originate from, it may be harder to mitigate the effects. And lack of water could also lead to lack of hygiene, so less showers and hand washing could facilitate the spread of disease, and diseases that are spread via the fecal oral route would be of the most concern, because if we are not able to keep clean, we will be more exposed to fecal matter and would allow us to spread these dangerous diseases more quickly. And the dry and warm conditions fostered by drought and heat events could result in certain fungi to become airborne. And one of these fungi would be the coccidioides, which is causes the disease valley fever, which is technically known as cocoid mycosis. And this disease is caused when fungal spores are inhaled, causing respiratory issues in the person. And the sustained drought and heat conditions can cause these spores to become more pervasive in the environment. And if global temperatures continue to increase, then drought and heat events could extend further north. So valley fever infections could mirror this movement, much like the spread of the vectors we talked about earlier. And cocoids were recently found as far north as Washington, which is farther north than they were ever expected to exist. So this is proof again that these temperatures could affect the range of these pathogens, and the farther north they get, they may not be able to deal with the effects, and because mostly they haven't seen them yet. Next, I would like to talk about sea level rise. And the rising sea level can inundate areas of the coastal cities and can also lead to storm surges in the case of disaster events like hurricanes. And this inundation can lead to standing water conditions which promote vector breeding, such as mosquitoes again. And coastal cities can, especially those in a tropical climate, could see a jump in conditions like West Nile virus, dengue fever, and chikungunya virus, just because of the spread of these vectors and promoting a condition which they can breed well. And recent paleontological studies have found possible evidence linking raised sea levels and parasite activity. So this particular study was very interesting and examined fossilized clams in Italy's Po River. This researcher found that parasite numbers in these clams seem to mirror the sea level rise. So as the sea level rose, the number of parasites in the clams also increased. So the researchers claimed that they were concerned for the interaction of parasites in the fishery industry as sea levels continued to rise. So of course this could lead to increased parasites on seafood and greater infection in humans. So as these sea levels continue to rise, these parasites can end up in many of the fish that we are eating, which could definitely pose a problem for many coastal populations and populations throughout the world. And sea level rise can help contribute to the creation of more toxic algal blooms. And sea level rise promotes warm and shallow water, which is the perfect breeding environment for toxic algae. The growth of this toxic algae has already proven to be harmful to humans, as we have seen in much of the red tide cases and some of the green-blue algae cases. So cases of respiratory irritation begin to pop up after the appearance of red tide in South Florida. or Southwest Florida, and other coastal cities could feel these effects as sea levels continue to rise and create more opportunities for algal bloom. So we could see spikes in conditions such as respiratory irritation and asthma as these conditions worsen and we see more of these events. So that brings me to the key takeaways. Climate change. First, I'd like to focus on that climate change is a multifaceted event. It grants the opportunity for a variety of pathogens to survive and thrive in the predicted conditions. Or by predicted conditions, I mean conditions that are predicted to happen in the future. And as evidenced throughout the presentation, there are multiple changes we can expect to accompany climate change. And all of these changes are accompanied with some advantage that can benefit the persistence of human pathogens. So we must keep that in mind as the environment continues to change. We must see how this interaction affects or deters certain aspects of the environment, such as vectors and reservoirs and the pathogens themselves, to see if they will become more prevalent or less prevalent. Next, another key takeaway would be that climate change can modify the effective range of pathogen persistence and effect. So changes in the environment can allow pathogens to reach geographic areas they may have not been able to reach before, like we mentioned with the fungal in southwest areas of the United States that made it up to Washington. And also, environmental change can bring pathogens closer to human residences than previously experienced. So if you're living in a coastal area on temperate conditions, you may be more affected by mosquitoes, but the mosquitoes may make their way farther north as temperatures begin to increase. And as is the case with flooding conditions and the increased prevalence of water and vector-borne diseases. And of course, it is the utmost importance to ensure vulnerable populations receive the proper attention to avoid outbreak events. The majority of pathogen-induced diseases discussed in this presentation have a larger effect on developing countries versus developed countries. This is the case because developed countries often have advanced intervention strategies in place already to avoid outbreak events, while many of these developing countries do not. Changes to the global climate could see an increase in outbreak events and even more loss of life in developing countries, especially if proper mitigation strategies are not installed. So it is important to communicate our state-of-the-art strategies for containing these pathogens and make sure that information is relayed to countries who may not be as infrastructurally developed to deal with these outbreaks, especially in the changing climate. And of course, these are the references I used for the presentation, and I thank you for listening.